There's lots of risks that are picked up by businesses, and I think more and more businesses starting this process of just anticipating and also setting financial resources aside to be able to respond if it comes to those kind of economic impacts.
You are listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.
Welcome to C-Suite Perspectives, a signature series by the Conference Board. I'm Steve Odland from the Conference Board and the host of this podcast series. And today we're going to discuss how businesses across the U.S. will need to prepare for the economic impact of increased flooding. Flooding from storms, from tide surges, and from all sorts of weather events. Joining me today is Alex Heil, the senior economist at the Conference Board. Alex, welcome.
Hello, Steve. Thanks for having me.
So, Alex, you've just written a new paper talking about flooding. Now, that's not a subject that you normally would expect a distinguished economist like you to be writing about, but you are writing about it in terms of the potential economic impact of flooding from these various events. Talk about the paper and what creates this risk.
Yeah, that's a good point. I do think that what just happened at the first week in July in Houston, in terms of the hurricane hitting the greater Houston area and the flooding that came with it, just reminded me of how much risk companies and households are exposed to when it comes to increased rainfall, storm surges, tidal flooding, and that this is not a cheap exposure, but actually requires a lot of planning, requires a lot of investment, and requires a lot of forward thinking in order to be able to withstand some of these impacts. So that's essentially the motivation for picking up flooding as one of my topics this month.
Yeah, and it's said that these weather events are driven by global warming, and that they're getting worse and worse. And you don't get into the core causes of it. You just say it's happening, it's increasing, it's getting worse, and here are the impacts, right?
Yeah, I think I take that certainly as a given what the scientific basis is, and I think overall with an average global surface temperature that is rising and an air temperature that is rising with it, there's more moisture that is picked up by the air, essentially, that can be carried by the air. So rain events during a storm, they become more intense, they can become more frequent. As a result of that, you have more flooding on the ground. For instance, during the hurricane in Houston, basically just a few weeks ago, there were 15 inches of rain during the first 24 hours. I mean, that's such a large volume that it overwhelms the local drainage system, and really the infrastructure is not able to keep up. So I think if we're looking at this, and we're also looking at the longer term trend, rates of precipitation on average have started to rise for decades now. And you combine that with some of the temperature rises that, we basically are looking at a world in which some of these events are expected to become more frequent and in their severity more intense.
Yeah. Now, some people, for some people, this is it's political, and we're not a political organization. We're not talking about this politically. For some people, this is all about, man-made global warming, and therefore, da 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 da. We're not coming at it that way. We're just saying things are changing. There's stuff that's happening, and you and I have spent a lot of time. You've written a lot about this, but we spent a lot of time in podcasts talking about carbon free 2050 and all of the various things that need to happen. So we've got a lot of recommendations out there. This is just basically, okay, this stuff is happening. Now, another key thing that I think you and I have talked about is that in the past there was not all this development right in these areas. I mean, there were areas where it was low lying, that there were swamps that people didn't build on them. But more and more today, as populations increase and development increases, you're seeing density along the coasts and in these storm-prone areas. So there's a combination of things going on here that create this damage that you're talking about.
Yeah, the exposure is the function of a variety of different factors, and it depends on how you look at it and how you what you hold constant. So it is certainly the case, with 40% of the US population living in coastal areas, that there is a lot of exposure to this kind of risk already. And even if you sort of pause for a moment and don't consider the additional development, it is true that larger segments of the country will be exposed just because because of sea level rise, because of greater of frequency and severity of rain events. Some of the areas that are at risk, the area just becomes bigger. And in addition, then, and that's also what you just mentioned, we're talking, those are attractive areas. They're right by the water. That's where people want to live. So there's also construction development going on in areas where, if one really considered it with a much more analytical eye, you probably shouldn't be building there. And I think that also is the case, not just building in the first place, but also rebuilding after a hurricane, after a storm event, where one could really think about, well, let's say an area was flooded, infrastructure was destroyed, residences and buildings and businesses were disrupted and destroyed as well. How do you rebuild? Should you rebuild? I think there's a big question about what this should look like going forward.
Yeah. Okay. So it's a really broad area. Okay. So now you did some estimates about the annual costs of just these storm surges and flooding that are happening with these weather events. Give us some numbers that you came up with.
Yeah, so this is the second time actually that I'm revisiting flooding and storm impacts as a topic for a paper. So these economic estimates that have been developed by researchers and policy analysts, they've changed over time. So initially, if you take, let's say, a hurricane season, the Congressional Budget Office estimated that the average annual cost associated with a hurricane season is anywhere around 56 billion in the US. Now, more recent estimates have put a much higher price tag on it, not necessarily because that's a function of this cost having exploded. And just to give you a sense, it's anywhere between 200 and 500 billion, which is almost a factor of 10, which is tremendous. But also the way that study that I came across looked at this was basically in a more inclusive way in terms of what is being counted. So it's not just the infrastructure damage, the building damage, but it's also damage to transit infrastructure, its productivity losses, its loss of economic output. So it depends on how you really structure economic impact analyses in that regard, what you count. But I think suffice it to say, if you use, let's say, insurance claims in states and you go back a couple decades, what you can find is that flooding related damage estimates have increased over time by about 50 million per year, and that's excluding some of the outliers. For instance, New Orleans during the hurricane down there. So I took out some of the outliers, and you can estimate um, insurance claims as a proxy for the overall damage incurred by flooding that are rising over time. And that's, if you, as we already did, if you unpack some of this, is due to several factors. But I think these are all relatively large numbers, and they tend to, the current trend is that they're increasing.
Yeah, and if part of this is due to state migration, as you said, a lot of people moving to uh, the South, the southern states, the Gulf states, Florida, and if you move to where there are hurricanes, you have a higher probability of losing your house to a hurricane or having significant damage to a hurricane. So a lot of it's that, but some of it also is just straight inflation. And now government regulators have tried to keep up with this by changing code and trying to make sure that houses, buildings, commercial property are less prone to hurricane and flooding damage. But at the same time, that raises building costs, and that goes into your number as well. So there's a lot of factors in this, but it's all going up. Is the point?
Yeah, I think that's correct. It's a function of all kinds of different factors, and we're seeing this not only in the U.S. but certainly globally, where cities and countries have started to respond to some of the flooding risks by changing the way that buildings are constructed, by elevating them, and not only buildings but also infrastructure, also roads. And some of these measures, they are truly expensive to implement.
Yeah, a lot of insurance companies are really struggling with this. And you see insurance companies pulling out of California due to regulatory conditions, but also increased earthquake and fire risk. You see them pulling out of Florida due to flooding risk. In this case, that's the subject here, and so forth. And so increasingly, that's throwing the burden on individuals, and states are having to step up to for the bailout. So it's costing everybody a lot of money, to deal with these issues.
Yeah, so last year, 2023, insurance companies lost money on homeowners policies in 18 out of 50 states. And so this is a problem that, the private sector, if you look at how much the insurance coverage can be, what this means in terms of premiums for homeowners, but it's not only homeowners, it's also businesses having property and casualty insurance with their respective state carriers. A lot of the risk at the end of the day, when the private insurers move out of an area, they cut coverage, they cut the services that they offer. A lot of this gets essentially handed down to the insurer of last resort, which is the government in many places.
So it used to be that insurers had pools of or organized pools, reinsurers. Lloyd's has always been a named reinsurer. What happened to that whole network?
Oh, like the reinsurance companies, Swiss Re and others, I mean, they're feeling the pinch now too. So this is now hitting, depending on where you look in this sort of supply chain of services on the insurance side. It's not just the insurance companies that offer policies to homeowners, businesses, and so forth, but it's also the reinsurance firms that offer insurance to the insurance companies, and they are now having to deal with some of the increased risks, some of the increased exposure, and how costs are going up. So this is something that, let's say 5, 10 years ago, a lot of analysts in this field would have said that some of these rising costs associated with greater impacts from climate change events, they're going to be picked up first in the insurance sector. And that's really what has happened. There's a lot of financial damage, financial exposure in that particular segment of the market.
Yeah, and it doesn't just hit. It used to be, okay, well then I don't want high insurance rates, so I'm not going to build on top of the San Andreas Fault. Well, the problem with that though is that these insurance costs are having to be spread over larger populations, larger numbers of insured people, and just because of the magnitude of the money and the losses that they need to cover. So even if you live at the highest point in Florida, inland, and there was zero risk of flooding in this, you still are paying rates that are 20-30% higher than they were just a few years ago because of the need to cover all of this. So it's everybody's paying for this.
Yeah, it's the model, that's the insurance model. You basically, spread out the cost recovery among all of your stakeholders, all of the policyholders, and that means that even if only for a few of them the claims rise, but at disproportionately higher rates, then costs are going to go up for everybody. I think we're seeing this in other insurance markets, certainly, but the property casualty homeowners market is there's no exception. That's now what is going on in that part.
Yeah. Now we've been talking about the impact on the insurance companies and that industry, but businesses outside of insurance also are incurring incremental costs. Talk about what businesses are experiencing and the new risks that they're experiencing.
Well, businesses have to, it's not only looking in the sort of traditional sense of, oh, there's asset damage, there's infrastructure damage, or there's damage to a building as a result of a storm event. Now we're really also talking about, what does this mean for the workforce? What does this mean for, the people that might be living close to an employment site, a company, and all of a sudden, either because of the higher insurance rates, going to make this less affordable for them to live close by, or because of storm damage itself, they might be, their essentially productivity, their labor force is disrupted, and that's going to be a risk that companies will have to pick up as well and have to anticipate. And the same applies to not just on the labor side, but certainly on just the supply chain of materials. You have to not only look at the supply chain when it comes to where do my materials come from and how resilient is my supply chain, but also then the set of events of bringing your products to markets, how much resilience is in that chain, how much, how resilient am I marketing my goods in that regard to whatever industry offering I have there. So I think there's lots of risks that are picked up by businesses, and I think more and more businesses starting this process of just anticipating and also setting financial resources aside to be able to respond if it comes to those kind of economic impacts.
We're talking about the increased risks and economic impact of flooding in the United States. We're going to take a short break and be right back.
What does the future of work mean for your employees? How will your company navigate ESG? Will there be a global recession? At the Conference Board, our experts translate the latest research and economic analysis into insights and real-time problem solving for your organization. Membership at the Conference Board provides your team with an assortment of knowledge from economics, marketing and communications, ESG, public policy, and human capital. As a member, you'll have access to our center experts, member-exclusive events, data and benchmarking tools, and peer sharing that will help you understand the present and shape the future. Consider becoming a Conference Board member today by visiting www.conference-board.org.
Welcome back to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm your host, Steve Odland from the Conference Board, and I'm joined today by Alex Heil, Senior Economist here at the Conference Board. Okay, Alex, before the break, we were talking about what businesses are doing to respond to these new risks of flooding and weather events. What other adaptation strategies can businesses adopt? What should they be thinking through that will help to mitigate their risks?
Well, I think it's if they consider their current operations, it's about resilience of their current supply chains, of their current locations, but then also, the planning is super critical. Planning in terms of where to open up new production facilities, how to manage the supply chain going forward. What about access to labor and product markets? I think those become very important, and I think ultimately this is not just a question going. It's not just going to be a question of financial resources that are made available by companies, but also should we really be in certain higher risk areas, or is it a more cost beneficial decision to move out of certain areas to avoid some of that risk?
Well, okay, if you take that, let's just take the coast. You said we've got 40% of the population on the coast. I mean, should we be redlining areas that just say these are we're not gonna build on this? I remember a discussion after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, and you said that there's this whole area that is below sea level. It's wiped out here in Katrina. It's going to get hit again. Who knows when, but it's going to hit again. Why don't we just not redevelop it and just let it be a flood zone? How reasonable is a strategy like that?
Well, for a major metropolitan area, that's obviously very challenging, not just from an economic and business perspective, but also from a heritage perspective, a cultural perspective. It's hard to just say, oh, we're just going to abandon a certain segment of the coastline. Similar conversations were had when it came to the Jersey Shore after the hurricane that hit a little over 10 years ago. And the state responded there with a program, especially the southern tip of New Jersey is especially prone to flooding because it's also some of the areas of the land is sinking into the sea, so it makes the sea level rise worse. So the state has responded with a strategy of sort of managed retreat, buying some properties, but not wholesale, but selectively, and certainly has rebuilt the Jersey Shore itself because it's a major attraction for tourism, for beachgoers in the summer. There's lots of people that have second homes there. So it gets very tricky also when one considers that some of the areas of the country that are most flood at risk of flood damage are also the ones, for environmental justice populations or low income populations or minorities. One has to be sensitive to what this actually means in terms of, the destiny of some of those residents in some of these areas.
Well, and then you have individual property rights. People own that property, whether it's
That's very
above
true. Yeah, absolutely.
water or below water. But the reason I ask the question is because there's just so many people, and including policymakers who just say, okay, well, we've just got to forbid building in these areas. But to your point, it's that's not a simple solution at all.
Yeah, I think that, there's other parts of the world where this has become a huge problem. There's countries that are so exposed to flooding. They've built, large networks of flood walls and infrastructure. The Netherlands come to mind. They have introduced systems in which certain newly constructed homes are essentially floating, so they go up and down with floods if they happen. Similar in Hamburg, in Germany, there are, building requirements that new construction needs to be essentially, elevated by a certain, amount in order to withstand future flooding. So there's different parts of the world have responded differently, but we're looking at, similar areas in the US that carry much higher risk of flooding. And if you project out a generation or two, it's going to be hard to protect all of them. And the cost of, continuous rebuilding is going to rise. And then from a policy perspective, ultimately one has to think about, how sustainable some of these areas are when it comes to, continued occupation.
Yeah, and then you read about Venice and the immense amount of money that they've thrown on those sea
Yeah.
gates that. But you can kind of justify it for a UNESCO heritage city essentially, which is what you have for most of Venice. But you're talking on the U.S. What is the U.S. eastern coastline? 1,500 miles, and the west coast is a little less. But I mean, it's economically impossible to do the
Yeah,
kind of
yeah, no,
things.
that's very true. New Jersey residents would certainly argue that the Jersey Shore should be protected too. It's not a UNESCO World Heritage Site, but um, I think that's very true. I think there's the other sort of, what we haven't talked about and what's important to also consider is the just, day to day flooding that occurs because of high tides. And that's become much more of a problem in some parts of especially along the Atlantic coast, in places like, Florida and Miami, places that are close to the water, places in which, development may have occurred on, infill and not necessarily on solid ground, places in which construction took place, let's say, on limestone that is porous, so water comes through. And so flooding occurs actually not from, let's say, the ocean in, but actually comes up from below and then affects streets, infrastructure, stormwater drains, and sewer infrastructure. And that can be very disruptive for some local communities and also create just cost and nuisance and impacts that local residents and businesses will have to deal with.
Yeah, it's interesting. On the barrier islands off of the east coast of Florida, people are raising their houses by 3 feet essentially. They're or a meter. They're you know
Yeah.
they're essentially severing the connections below, jacking the whole house up. I mean, the cost of these moves are just unbelievable. But they've got to do something because it's a rising problem. Not to make a pun, but there's nothing you can do about this. We've got our long term plans and carbon, but I think you've got to assume for the next 100 years until we can kind of get things moving, back down in temperature and get more of the Earth's water tied up in ice. We just have to deal with this, and the coasts are going to move inland.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, if you look at the median projection of what's going to happen to sea level rise, and that's going to vary depending on, where you look. So the projections are different. I mean, on average, it might be 3 feet, but that's going to affect the coast in Alaska very different from South Florida. So this depending on how the land mass moves up and down, that's going to affect what the net change is. But be that as it may, I think the impacts are going to be significant. And as a result of that, 3 feet of sea level rise, if that's your sort of median estimate of how much exposure there is, that's going to mean a lot of communities will have to do something and pretty soon in order to plan and just elevate infrastructure. And that's not saying something that's bigger problems occur, for instance, in the developing world where millions of people in places like Jakarta and other places are within an inch or so of sea level right now. And so if that is, if there's sea level rise there, it's going to create all kinds of problems. In the US, there is certainly funding available to address some of these problems and some of these, fund some of these mitigation strategies. But one really needs to think about this from a cost benefit angle of where does it make the most sense to spend some of the money.
We talked a little bit about some of the potential public policy reactions to this, including just red zoning areas, which is easier said than done, as we said. Any other policy changes that you're seeing that could work or that you're recommending?
If you take sort of a very straightforward economist's perspective, then, you know, the argument would be you have to make people realize that wherever they live, what's the degree of risk that they're exposing themselves to. And so as a result of that, if you shield them from the cost, they're going to be more likely to just ignore the risk and keep living where they are. So that means higher insurance rates actually serve the purpose of communicating some of the elevated risk, as well as the cost of rebuilding homes after flood events and so forth. On the other hand, though, the problem with that is that it certainly affects households directly. There's affordability. There's people that just simply can't afford to do anything, and they can't afford to move. They can't do just up there all their belongings and move to a part of the country that is less prone to flooding. They are culturally and socially connected to the area where they live. So it is a very difficult and challenging situation. And how one should be addressing this with policy, I think the country is also grappling with that.
Yeah, it does argue though that state and local governments could probably focus on educating their populace, right? But it's a bit of a conflict. I mean, you just take Florida, for instance. Every town and municipality is fighting for more residents because they want higher tax dollars from property taxes and sales taxes, more development, and everybody loves the coast, as you said. So on one hand, they're trying to attract more people. On the other hand, it creates more risk, which then ultimately the government, local and state and federal, become the insurer of last resort. So it's a double-edged sword, and they need to take the full context into account as they're considering their strategies.
Yeah, I think that's very true. Those areas, where people like to live by the ocean, they're attractive. They are, from a property tax perspective, there certainly are, communities and municipalities are trying to maximize that from just a financial perspective. The whole entire concept of beaches is has been disrupted by building seawalls, by trying to sort of retain beaches in their locations where they currently are. But sand has a tendency to move around with the movement of the ocean, and the more it's sort of narrowly constrained, the more problem that's going to create in terms of beach erosion. That is going to be hard to fix. Bringing in sand is costly. It's not always an option. And natural solutions, some parts of the country have sort of gone the way of having greater emphasis on rebuilding wetlands, having mangroves not being cut down, having anything along like the Billion Oyster Project in New York Harbor, anything along the lines of having a natural solution is also a possibility. But it really takes and it's not obviously the right strategy for all parts of the country, but certainly also something that should be considered. But it's not the panacea, but it's a part of the planning process.
So, any final thoughts, Alex, as you think through your paper?
Yeah, I mean, I find it's very struggling. What I'm struggling with this concept. I mean, I love the ocean. I love the beach. I lived in Hawaii for 2 years, so I'm personally corrupted. in favor of beach life and aloha culture, so to speak. What I do find most disturbing actually is the greater flooding risk that comes from rainfall that is, far away from the coast. So if you look at some of the maps in terms of um, the the exposure and the risk in parts of the United States where some of those pockets of land are, they're not necessarily always right on the ocean because rain. These rainfall rates of 10, 12, 15 inches in the first day of a storm, they can completely overwhelm infrastructure, and it doesn't have to be right by an ocean or right by a water body. So I think that's really a risk that a lot of people might not be aware of, and that's going to affect them personally because houses are not, they're just not resilient enough to withstand that much water in that short period of time.
All right, Alex Heil. They can find your paper if they want to read the full your full analysis at www.tcb.org/economy, strategy, and finance, and then look under publications. Alex, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thanks very much for having me, Steve.
And thanks to all of you for listening to C-Suite Perspectives. I'm Steve Odland, and this series has been brought to you by the Conference Board.
You have been listening to C-Suite Perspectives, a podcast by the Conference Board.